Welcome back to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast, powered by ISOFIT and Firefly Recovery. ISOFIT is my go-to for all things isometric strength training. For more on ISOFIT, be sure to check out isofit.com. Episodes like this are made possible by Firefly, the official recovery provider of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast. For more on Firefly, be sure to check out recoveryfirefly.com. This episode is powered by Dr. Ray Gorman, founder of Engage Movement. Learn how to boost your income without relying on sessions. Get a free training on the blended practice model by following at Ray Gorman DPT on Instagram. Bri, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today, and huge shout out to our friend Kara for getting us connected that way. For people who aren't familiar with you, your background in the ski space, and all the amazing things you're doing now in the psychology world that way, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all the great things you've got going on?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for having me. So I started ski racing when I was really young. I think I was on skis, when I could walk around 1, 2, and then started racing at 6 years old. We grew up in Colorado, so there was easy access to the mountain. It was the classic, family ski days on the weekend. And then, yeah, from there, skiing kind of took off. I was like missing school in fifth grade to go train in the afternoon. And then for high school, my mom moved across the country with my sister and I. We attended Burke Mountain Academy, and what was there for 4 years. And then after I left Burke, I was, trying to figure out next steps. I was dealing with some injuries at Burke, and, knew I wanted to go to college. So I was, figuring out how can I best set myself up to be competitive, in the college racing sphere. And there was a new international ski team that was starting up in Europe, who one of my previous coaches at Burke was starting. So the timing worked out great on that. And so I spent a gap year in Europe racing with an international ski team. That's where I met Cara. And then after that, I started at Dartmouth College and skied for them for, what was kind of 4 years, but, I had some injury in there and COVID and stuff. So yeah, that was pretty much my ski journey. And then post skiing, I am now in Michigan, getting my PhD in clinical psychology. So
That's amazing. I mean, you're living quite an impressive life that way, from skiing on the international stage to Ivy League education, living across the country that way. I mean, what an impressive life you've had so far, Bri. And you brought up some amazing things that I want to dive into a little bit more. I mean, first off, the whole concept of skiing from such a young age. I remember when we talked last time, we kind of both had that in common with us that way, where I started skiing right around 18 months and you started skiing about the same time that way. And it's one of those things that I feel like, at least from my experience, when you start something that young, it becomes second nature to you. So much so that now, I'm lucky to ski maybe a week or two every year. But when I go, it feels like just second nature. It's like I haven't lost anything, even though I don't do it as frequently as I used to, because I started at such a young age. I'm interested to hear more about kind of your thoughts on that, and if any of the psychological development stuff that you're studying now kind of plays into that at all.
yeah, great question. Yeah, it's really interesting. I think there's actually a bunch of stuff coming out, over the last couple of years about, kids specializing early in sports and how it's like a race at this point. How early can you get your kid in the sport? Because it's getting more and more competitive, and kids are getting faster and faster and better in their respective sports. And there is some psychological research out there on, kind of the harms on, specializing kids really early and, pushing kids into this really competitive environment early on. But I think, as long as the kids are enjoying it and that's, kind of driven by them and something that they want to do, I think you kind of get into this, interesting space where you have like parents who are really pushing, and then kids often get pushed out of the sport early, or retire early because they were pushed into it really young and never really developed that early intrinsic motivation to be in the sport, and we're kind of just doing it for that external reward or because their parents made them. So
Absolutely. What made you so interested and connected with the sport of skiing that way from a young age? And what kept you going with it long term? Was it something that, to kind of use what you just outlined that way, was it something that was almost like an expectation for you? Like, hey, we're a skiing family, so you're going to be a skier? Or was it something that you sort of fell in love with during your time kind of within the sport that way?
Yeah, I think my love for the sport developed over the years, really. Like at the beginning it was a family thing. So my dad grew up ski racing and, kind of t showed us the ropes and everything. And so early on it was kind of like, oh, we're skiing because the family skis and that's, a family activity. And I think it really took me until I was maybe in high school, really, when I kind of had my own, the expectation was like I'm responsible for my training and I think I had a bit of a moment where I was like, why am I doing this? And I really enjoyed like the team aspect and the community aspect of the sport. I am a very competitive person, and so I think that like drive to be better really kept me going for a while and through injury and stuff. So yeah, I think ultimately it shifted. At the beginning it was more because my parents did it, and then towards the end, I kind of had to think about, why am I doing this and why am I doing it for me versus for other people?
Absolutely. No, 100%. And I love that you kind of had that realization and shift of like, hey, I'm doing this for me. But it also kind of is like a little hat nod and pays respect to those that helped you get to that point as well. And I've had number of podcasts with others diving into skiing and ski racing, whether that's the podcast we did with Cara or Reagan Dewhurst or any of these other amazing people. And one of the things that comes up over and over again when I'm talking with individuals in this skiing space that way is skiing is an incredibly accessible sport. A lot of people can ski and enjoy it. However, there is a huge gap between the sport being accessible and the racing population, in my opinion. And I think a lot of times people don't understand or appreciate the significance of that gap, right? If you have someone that just goes out and wreck skis and maybe they hit the greens and the blues, like that's totally fine. But when you enter the world of ski racing, it's not so much just the enjoyment piece of it. Obviously, it's a lot of fun, and I always love bombing hills and going 60 miles an hour and stuff. It's great, but there's a lot of risk associated with that when you're going that fast. You see what hitting a tree, driving a car at that speed does to the car. Well, think about what hitting a tree would do when you don't have anything around you, right? It's just you and you're going that fast down the hill. One, two, the equipment considerations, like whether that be the boots and the speed suits when it's freaking cold outside, or the fact that you're like messing around with the wax on your skis just to get it to the right temperature, and you spend way longer doing that than you wanted to because that's what it takes to be competitive at this level. There's a lot of little minute things that go into it from the preparation standpoint and even the training standpoint as well. I'd say, like, a lot of times when I tell people, like, yeah, growing up, like, we would unbuckle our boots at the top of the hill and we would ski down with our boots, completely unstrapped, completely unbuckled. And they're like, why would you do that? But it's like it teaches you skills that carry over into the racing world that give you that slight edge that you need to be competitive that way. I'm interested to hear kind of your takes and thoughts on that element of ski racing, because for lack of a better way to put it, it's a phenomenal sport that I found so enjoyable and addicting. However, a lot of the components of it are not necessarily pleasant and things that we can really like explain to people in a rational sense unless you've tried it, I feel.
Yeah, I still feel like I can't explain ski racing to anyone in a rational way. I'll say talk about the equipment and the weather and all the different variables and aspects that go into it. And at the end of the conversation, it's always like, wait, so why did you do this? But yeah, I mean, I think it's as you said, it's an addicting sport. Like there's something about like that risk and like being right on the edge of, okay, I could, fall at a very high speed at any point right now. And just like that, I don't know, the feeling of like a perfect turn or, every run, like pushing yourself to be a little bit faster and better. I think that, over time is what drives people to kind of keep going. But there are, the sport is ridiculous in that you're literally putting in hours of, training into tuning your skis and your, tweaking your equipment. Like, I mean, I had one season where I was messing with like the canting on my boots. I was also having like shin issues at the same time, so there was some of that, but like we're talking half a degree like tilting in the outside of my boot. When you're at that level in the sport, it's something you feel, but you're messing with these like super, super small details for hundredths of a second, right? Like the difference between first and second place oftentimes in races is, a matter of hundredths or tenths. And so we're doing all this stuff and, making sure the wax is right for the temperature of the snow. And like I remember as a female athlete in the sport, we always talked about like braiding your hair versus wearing your hair in a ponytail, like little things like that. And then it comes down, you could have one turn where you mess it up and you lose 3/10 right there. So you're putting in all this effort, and then if you scrub a turn, it can be up to a second that you just lost. So it's a frustrating sport. It's one of those things that I feel like in all the races I did, maybe you get 5 to 10% of races where you're like, wow, that felt really good, or I'm really proud of that, result or effort. And the other 90% or 95% is just you're kind of banging your head against a wall. But it's really those breakthrough results where you're like, oh, okay, this is the magic.
Absolutely. And I feel like the adrenaline rush you get from all of those, even the low points in that journey, right? The highs and the lows. There's something about the concept of going really ridiculously fast down a hill, acknowledging the risk that's associated with it, and realizing just how much work and prep you put in just to get to that moment. And again, that accumulates over the years, but also just in the days and hours leading up to the event, right? It's not uncommon for me to get to the mountain at like maybe they open at like 8:30. That's typical opening time up in Pennsylvania where I grew up. And there's people that have been there since 4 or 5 in the morning prepping for like their ski racing, like right. Like there's a lot of sacrifices that are made for this sport that way. And I feel like all of that just kind of fuels the adrenaline and exciting nature of the sport that way. And it's one that I don't really find that in a lot of other sports, or maybe it exists but just not quite in the same caliber as it does in the ski racing world, at least for me that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think something that's, unique about the sport too is there's, not only are there all these factors and variables that we're tweaking, but there's also all these factors and variables that are out of our control on any given day. So, you're skiing on a different hill for every race day. So you have that, new unique situation. You have the snow condition is going to be different, like from one run, from one turn to the next turn. The weather can roll in, you can have pitch sunny skiing for the first 10 racers and then the fog rolls in. So there's just so much unpredictability. And I think that is part of what, keeps it so interesting is you have to be adaptable in the sport, and you have to be able to kind of manage different conditions and, different variables that are out of your control.
Absolutely, I completely agree. Now, in relation to your own ski racing career, what events did you race in? Were you a Super G or GS? What did you race in, and what did your own kind of training and prep for those look like?
So early on, growing up in Colorado, there was much better access to speed venues. They just have longer terrain and the ability to kind of, set a downhill or a super G race. And I think Cara explained this a bit in her podcast, but basically, downhill is the gates are the farthest apart. It's the fastest event. And then it goes to super G. They're a little closer together, GS, giant slalom, and then slalom. And so downhill and super G are considered the speed events, and GS and slalom are considered the tech or the technical events. And so early on, like at age 12, we were downhill training, which is crazy to me after, moving and spending the latter half of my career on the East Coast. Like you just don't do that. So I had a lot more speed exposure when I was younger. And I think that I had a bit of a natural like giftedness towards speed. I think being on snow so early, it gave me kind of a feel for the snow and for my skis, and that's really helpful for speed. However, I think the combination of the jumping, so like getting air time, as well as just like really risking things was not, I was like a very technical, pretty skier. And so I think my coaches tried to kind of push me in towards the speed direction, especially through like my high school years. And sometimes, like in the US in particular, it can be easier to make, well, this is up for debate. In my opinion, it can be easier to make national team criteria through speed events. So they were kind of trying to push me in that direction. And ultimately, I decided, through a combination of factors and injury and stuff, that I wanted to go the college route, and in college you only ski tech events. And so kind of the latter half of my career was just slalom and GS.
Absolutely. And it sounds like you kind of dabbled in everything and then kind of transitioned in accordance with kind of what phase of your career and life you were in. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't talk about, or a lot of sports don't have, is like, if I'm playing lacrosse, it's not like I can just, scale down my lacrosse like ability from like being reliant on my speed to being a lot more technical. Like I can't just flip that switch the same way I can. Whereas ski racing, if you don't want to run Super G and you just decide to enter slalom, like you're shifting event types literally on the fly that way. It's almost like I think of like track and field going from being like a 800 runner to like a 200-meter runner. It's like that kind of shift. It's still the same sport, if you will. However, the demands that go into it and the actual type of event is drastically different. I think that's something that's really enticing to me about the ski racing side of things, is just how it can cater to pretty much anyone that's willing to put in the work that to get to that level of competitive nature that it takes. And again, it's a lot of work, it's a lot of hours put in to be good at this. But if you put that time in and you get to that level, it's like, if you don't want to run downhill and Super G anymore, you can switch. If you don't want to run slalom anymore, you can switch. Obviously, there's more work to do to be good at those things, but you can still do it. And I haven't met any mogul ski racers yet, but I mean, that's another one. If you're crazy enough to want to go out and do that, be my guest. It's so appealing to me in the sense that it allows something for everyone, I feel. And that goes back to, I think what you touched on earlier is just this like community feel that comes with the ski racing side of things, right? It's not something that I would say millions and millions of people are in on. Like, one person, odds are you can get connected to almost anyone in the space and in the community that way. It's just a very tight knit group of people. It's not the biggest like sport by nature, I don't think, but it's one of those things that I think there's a lot of power that comes from the fact that you're all around other people that are trying to do the same thing as you, similar goals, similar mindset, but also like they understand, just like you mentioned earlier, every run is different. Everyone's going to have good days and bad days. Like there's just a lot of variables and factors that go into it. And I think the more you can kind of lean into that community aspect of the sport, the better off it is for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. The ski world is such a small world. I think, and it's something that continues. I'm 3 years out of the sport, and I still keep in touch with, a lot of the people that I was with throughout my career, and you kind of have those different pockets. Like I feel like I have, my high school group of friends and my gap year group of friends and my college group of friends, and honestly, like they're still my best friends to this day. So yeah, it's a really cool sport in that I think you become really close to your teammates, and to the community in general.
What was different for you about competing growing up in like the high school type of events where you're getting pulled out of school early to go compete versus international versus collegiate competition at Dartmouth that way? How did those levels all kind of differ from one another from a competition standpoint?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, I mean, in high school at Burke, we this is kind of a funny fact that people like cannot wrap their head around, but we didn't get grades at Burke. And
Really?
so yeah, so everything was like narrative based. So at the end of every term or semester, we got like a written narrative from each of our teachers about, what we could do better, and what was going well. And so I think, and the Burke community, there's like 60 students, I think, these days. And everyone's used to that. Like, everyone at the school has crazy training schedules and race schedules. And so the expectation kind of is that there is some flexibility on the school front. And not to say that we didn't do school, like we did, but there was one winter where I was in like 8 English classes or something, because I was just traveling that much. So I think going from that kind of, laid back school, really intense ski environment, and then in my gap year where I wasn't doing any school, and skiing is much bigger over in Europe. I think Cara talked about that a bit, but it's a whole other world over there. Like it is, yeah, it's just it was kind of surreal to be in this space where, it's kind of like maybe not soccer or football here, but it's, much bigger over in Europe. And so that was neat to kind of feel like, there were more spectators at races, and you could like walk into a coffee shop and people be interested in what you were doing, and the ski racing would be on versus the football being on. And then so going from like being fully immersed in this completely ski racing world to then going to college and first of all feeling like I was thrown in the deep end after not having grades and taking a year off not doing school to, going to Dartmouth was, yeah, a whole learning curve experience for me. But I think, my teammates were really helpful in kind of teaching me the ways and, how you navigate talking with professors and missing classes. And I learned very quickly that if a professor was not okay with you missing classes, then you just couldn't take that class. And so we had a list of like 8 classes that you could take in the winter, and it was guaranteed that like throughout your 4 years at Dartmouth, you would take all 8 of those classes because those were the only teachers, that were okay with us missing as much as we needed to miss. So there were some random ones like evolution of Earth and life, and I had quite the list of courses I took by the end. But yeah, that was fascinating. Kind of taking this like okay, now school is the primary priority, and skiing kind of comes second, and it was much higher demand in college. I found like we were training 30 hours per week. And obviously the academic demands don't decrease. So we would, be staying up until, 11 p.m. doing homework when you got back from training, and then you had to do your skis. So another hour in the tuning room. So it was busy. College was busy.
Quick break, because if you're a rehab professional sick of burnout, this could be your answer. Engage Movement's blended practice model is a proven system built by Dr. Ray Gorman, a PT who walked away from the 55-hour-a-week grind and built a blended practice model that doubled his income while working less than 25 hours a week, and he didn't have to rely on the traditional way of selling sessions to do so. It's all about blending remote and in-person services, stacking monthly recurring revenue, and building a business that finally supports your life, not the other way around. This model isn't just theory. Real providers, including myself, are creating lives of freedom and flexibility without being tied to their schedule. And as a listener, you get free access to the complete training. DM my name, Dan, to @RayGormanDPT on Instagram and receive your free breakdown on the model. Absolutely. And it's interesting to hear you say that, because obviously when skiing is everything, right? When you're over in Europe, like skiing is life, you go all in on that thing. Everything is dialed, or like the word that's real trendy right now is optimal. I don't
Mhm.
know what that word even means, but you're getting your sleep, you're getting your, good food, you got plenty of time for the apres afterwards if you're into that sort of thing. Like you can pretty much do whatever you want. Versus college, that all changes drastically. And now all of a sudden, instead of 8 hours of sleep, we're down to 5 hours of sleep. Instead of like, oh my gosh, I've got an hour, 2 hours after I wrap up the ski day to literally just sit back, chill, relax. Stress level's going to come down, just hang with the crew that way and have a good time. To, oh, I've got to go do homework. I've got to go write this essay. I've got to go write this paper. And keep in mind, for those listening, this is prior to the Chat GPT era, because I feel like a lot of times now people are like, oh, I'll Chat GPT it, it'll be fine. This is before we had the ability to do that, and we still had to write our own papers and generate our own outlines and do all this stuff by ourselves that way. And I feel like there's this, like, I don't know what the right word is for it, just this intangible skill that comes from doing stuff like that, where it's like you're in high level sport, right? You're in D1 sport, you have an Ivy League education, you've got to merge the demands of the two of them at the same time as you're trying to navigate your kind of early adult life that way. And I feel like when you do all of that successfully, or even if you're not 100% successful by your definition of success at it, but you're navigating all of that without any influence or assistance from tech and AI and all these different things, when you do that, like it just leads you up for success in anything you pursue later in life. It's like, hey, look what I accomplished and look what I overcome without much assistance at all, right? Like obviously you got your friends and family, but outside of them, it's a lot of work that you put in by yourself to get to that point. And I think there's like this lost art, in my opinion, of doing the work that it takes to succeed through that, push yourself through the long nights and kind of burn the midnight oil, metaphorically, if you will. I just feel like a lot of times that's becoming a thing of the past now. And I think that there's something valuable that teaches, even though I can't necessarily put that in words.
I think college, and I think a lot of people have this experience. They talk about how college like chills them out, because we come from these ski academies where you have all these resources, the nutrition side of things, as you were discussing, sports psychologists, athletic trainers. You're working out for 2 hours a day or whatever, and specific time for tuning skis. So it's all very structured and in a way that we're trying to optimize performance. And then you get to college, as you said, and it's like, okay, what do I need to prioritize? I don't have time to do an hour stretch every day. And so I think that was really helpful for me in realizing I can still, perform and compete at a high level without getting 8 hours of sleep and without, having an hour-long stretching routine. And I think it was good to figure out what I needed to prioritize to still compete at a high level, without, feeling like I needed to be doing all these little things, and that was gonna, it does make a difference, but you're able, in my opinion, I think you see a bunch of college skiers who are able to compete at a really high level, without having a lot of time to do all the little things.
Absolutely. And on top of all the little things that popped up, you mentioned a few times that you had a number of different injuries that also popped up throughout your ski career. And some of them were a little more than just little things. Like I feel like a lot of times when I talk with ski racers, there's this expectation that injury is going to occur, but typically it's just like minor stuff. Like you're definitely going to lose a few toenails during your ski racing career, and your feet are probably not going to be the things that you want to show everyone on the beach in the summertime that way. It's just kind of a side effect of the sport that way. But there's been some really gruesome ski injuries that I've heard about, from skis slicing through IT bands to compartment syndrome to ACLs and so many different things that way. For those listening, what has your kind of personal experience with injury in the sport of skiing looked like that way? And how were you able to overcome all of those things?
Yeah, my first injury was pretty early on. I was 11, I think. I was skiing speed and I straddled. So, straddling is where one ski goes on one side of the gate and the other ski goes on the other. So, I straddled a Super G gate, going like probably 50 miles an hour. Wouldn't recommend. And my leg just hyperextended. So I ended up like fracturing my tibial plateau and damaging my growth plate, which was the real concern because I was still young and growing. So I was off snow for, I think, that whole season. But I was young, it was one of those things where I was like, oh, okay, like I'll just go back to school and, be with my friends. But I think it was, an early realization of, wow, it's just one of those split second things that can happen. And it changes your season. And then I had a good gap where I didn't have, any significant injuries, as you mentioned, like lose my toenails every season, that would happen. And then it was in high school when I was at Burke, probably my sophomore year. I was a really avid runner. Like I ran a lot growing up. And I loved running in high school. It was like my escape and my time when I could just clear my head. And I started having like foot drop. So I couldn't pick up like my toe basically when I was running, during our fall training. And then by the time I got on snow, I was having just major like nerve pain in my shins and was really struggling to ski. It was one of those things where I would hit a bump and I would just immediately go out of the course because the pain was so sharp. And I was also experiencing like a lot of numbness in my feet and my calves. And it was, oh my gosh, like months of, I was in the athletic trainer's office every day and we were trying different things. And I, was going to doctor's appointments. They thought maybe I had like some artery syndromes and stress fractures was thrown out there. And finally, I think actually the Burke athletic trainer was like, hey, I know like one of my buddies who had this thing called compartment syndrome. It might be worth getting tested. And at the time, there was only one other ski racer who actually is on the Canadian national team now, Val Grenier, who had experienced compartment syndrome and she had ended up getting surgery for it. So I went, it took forever to be able to get in for testing. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the compartment syndrome testing, but they need to figure out how to do it in a less painful way. They basically take like a massive needle and just like stick it into your shin and calf compartments and measure the pressures that way. So yeah, I got tested in Boston and they were like, wow, your numbers are off the chart. And then from there it's kind of like, okay, what do I do? So I talked to some surgeons and they were like, yeah, it's kind of 50-50 chance, you get surgery and it works. So basically they just like release the compartment. And I, at the same time, was finishing up a season, which ended up being really good, which was shocking to me because I was also dealing with my shins and I had like 60 race starts that year or something. It was nuts. So at the end of the season, I had a national team invitation and I had just gotten my compartment syndrome diagnosis, but I needed to meet like injury clearance to accept the team nomination. So if I got surgery, I wouldn't meet that clearance. And so ultimately I had to decide like, do I get surgery for the shins and, kind of move forward with that and, decline the national team up invitation. And it was a tough decision. Like that had been my like life, my childhood dream was to ski on the national team and compete in the Olympics. And so I think it was a real moment for me where I was like, am I going to be able to ski at the level I want to ski at with this injury? And ultimately, I decided that I could not, and so I went ahead and I got the surgery. It was super successful. And I didn't have any real issues with my compartment syndrome after that. There were a bunch of people in the sport who, like years after I went through it, it started to pop up. I think like five of my friends at this point have had compartment syndrome diagnosis. So there's something going on. It's, very common in Nordic skiing, but there's some theory out there that maybe like the tightness of the boots or just how much run training we do. So yeah, that was compartment syndrome. And then by the time I got to college, I hadn't had injury for, I guess it would have been 2 years. And then at the end of our COVID season, it was the last race of the year. And I was skiing at Burke, actually, my home mountain. And in like a second run, it was like kind of spring conditions, totally user error though. I high-sided, which in skiing is where you like your outside ski catches up and you kind of like flip around in the air. And I landed on my head initially and went unconscious. I think I was unconscious for like 5 minutes, but in the crash, like tumbled and ended up breaking my tibia, not my fibula, which hung in there somehow. And then recovered from that, which was a whole thing. Crazy what modern medicine can do though with like rods in your leg and then you can just walk like a week later. And was coming back from that injury. I was 3 days on snow and I did the exact same thing to my left leg. So I'm now very symmetrical. But yeah, it was quite the injury saga at the end of my career for sure.
That's quite a like robust experience with injuries, for lack of a better way to put it. My goodness. And it's interesting because I feel like anytime I talk with skiers, the knee injuries come up, whether that's tibia or ACLs or cartilage things, or in your case, literally a fractured growth plate and a fractured tibial plateau that way. Like it's crazy to think about the kind of things that come up that way. And the compartment syndrome comes up significantly less often for me. However, to your point, there's something going on there, and I don't think we fully understand it. I've had several conversations with surgeons I know that specialize in the foot and ankle that do fasciotomies for compartment syndrome, and they can't fully understand it either. I mean, there's some, to your point on the testing, that are doing fasciotomies now without testing because they're like, well, if you base the diagnosis based on their symptoms and based on some of the different things that they're, presenting with, like it's going to show up positive. We're 99.9% sure. So why are we going to put someone through this traumatic experience of, like you said, testing the pressures of their compartments? And some of them even order the pressures to be measured at rest and with exertion because they want to see like, hey, what does it do when we actually exert ourselves? So usually running on a treadmill or something like that. So now you're not just getting it done once, but you're getting it done multiple times and also running in there as well, because, that wasn't just enough to have it done once or twice that way. So it's certainly a traumatic thing to get it assessed, but to the point that you made, there's definitely something going on with it, and we don't fully understand the diagnosis. We don't fully understand what to do from a surgical standpoint either, because like you mentioned, the research is very clear that we're still 50-50 with our outcomes. And that's ultimately what I've seen clinically as well. Half the people that get surgery, they're great. They're, cases like yours. The other half are people that literally get a second fasciotomy or a third one because it scarred in too much and they redeveloped their symptoms again. And until we like spend a little bit more time researching this and understanding it, I feel like we're ultimately just going to continue to guesstimate at best and do what we've always done. But I can't help but wonder if we could be doing something more, if we could be doing something better. And to your point, obviously, the tightness of the ski boots, I could certainly see kind of contributing to this. But I would also say, just in general, the lifestyle shift that I've seen among some of the different skiers to the point where all they do now is ski. Like when I was growing up, like we skied in the winter, but we also played indoor soccer. And then we played baseball in the spring. And then we played outdoor soccer. And in the summertime, we grew up in like Finger Lake area of New York. So it's like we're water skiing, we're wakeboarding, we're doing all these like crazy different things versus now, like there's times when I talk with skiers that all they do is ski, period. Like there's no other physical development. Even to the point you made on running, a lot of them don't even bother to run anymore because they're like, well, why do I need to? I'm a skier. So I think that there's a lot of variables and factors in play around that compartment syndrome kind of conundrum, for lack of a better way to put it. And I can't wait to see what work gets done to try and shed some light on this very cloudy situation that a lot of people kind of find themselves in that way. Having your kind of knowledge basis on the psychological side right now, I know we've talked before in sports psychology is not necessarily something you see in your future, but just reflecting back on your own injuries and kind of the psychological turmoil that takes when you're going from literally skiing every day you want to in the winter to, hey, my season's over because this injury happened. Reflecting back, what kind of things were challenging for you from like a mental and psychological standpoint that way? And what advice do you offer to other individuals who maybe are in similar situations where, hey, maybe it's middle of ski season, injury happens, season ends early, not on their terms. How do they go about best navigating that in your mind?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, and I think that the injury rate in athletes is so high, and so it's not talked about enough, what to do from a mental standpoint, because everyone experiences it, in their own way. But I think there's a lot of common things that come up and with skiing in particular. And I think I was, lucky in my first two injuries, the first one being, a chronic injury, and the second one I was unconscious, so I actually don't have really any memory of it. But I think there is this kind of flashback situation that happens when people have these really intense crashes. And when you're back on skis, like, and Cara talked about this, I think, a little bit too, but I remember for a while after my second leg break, I would just kind of see myself like going into a turn and like that feeling would kind of pop back into my head or that visual. And so I think there is, some of that like imagery stuff that comes up and getting beyond that. And I think like in the mindfulness space has been something that is kind of I saw at the end of my career like really come into the sport and coaches using that and sports psychologists and I think there are a lot of principles within that like both in the imagery side of things, but that like rational acceptance of, like I'm injured now and I can't change this. There's nothing that I can do to, reverse what has happened. And then I also think like from a pain standpoint, like a lot of people deal with some, pretty gnarly pain after surgery or, when you're doing PT and stuff. And I think kind of like being able to put yourself in a headspace where you're not resisting that and you've kind of like come to terms um, with that pain is another aspect that I think mindfulness is really helpful for. But yeah, personally for me, that was a big thing that I found to be very helpful. I also was the type of person who just was like going to push every limit that I possibly could in PT and the timeline for getting back to snow. And I know, probably a lot of athletes have a similar experience. And I was like, if, the doctor says 8 weeks, it'll be 3 weeks. And so I think, looking back on it, I did have a feeling going into my, return from my first leg break that I, wasn't super strong. Like I was like, this is the least strong that I've ever felt getting back onto snow. And I had been cleared by my surgeon and stuff, but I to this day I still wonder like, oh, if I had been a little bit stronger coming back from my first leg break, would the second one have happened? And looking back on the video and everything, it was a freak accident. But I do think, for people who are going through injury, it's tough to have that like foresight in, okay, looking back, am I going to regret this decision? Should I spend more hours in the gym? Am I pushing it a little bit too much? But I think, ultimately you know your body, like you have that sense and that intuition. And I think, the combination of listening to what you're feeling and listening to the advice of, the PTs that you're working with and the surgeons and stuff, I found, that's that happy medium in between, knowing when to push, and also, taking advice from doctors and PTs seriously, but also, they're not in your body and sometimes they don't specialize in your sport. So, I think, yeah, that combination of advocating for yourself, but also like listening and being open to to the advice is really important.
I 100% agree with that. That is great insights. And as you mentioned, a lot of times sports med providers don't always understand your sport and what you're feeling. And I think this is an area where I always advocate for people to literally interview whoever their team is going to be before they start the process with them. Like, hey, ask your ortho questions, ask your PT questions, ask anyone who's going to be involved in your care all the questions you want and clear them up from the start. And if something is not comfortable or sitting right to you, it's okay to go out and interview other ones. It's okay to get second opinions, or some have even gotten third opinions, and that is perfectly okay. And again, that applies to anything from your PT selection to your surgeon selection and beyond. I find a lot of times athletes come to me and they say, well, I went to some place because they told me they were nice people, and other people recommended them because they're nice. And then they start going there and realize they have no knowledge about their sport and they have no plans to get them back to sport. They're just going to kind of do what they've always done and treat them with the same 10 to 12 exercises that they give everyone. And it's unfortunate that situations like that occur. But as you mentioned, we can avoid those and we can prevent those the majority of the time. And on top of that, I think that there's something empowering that comes from you taking charge of your situation when stuff like this happens, because obviously when injury occurs, the locus of control is kind of ripped from you, right? Hey, I can't go out and ski anytime I want now. I'm waiting on a timeline. I'm waiting on someone else to tell me when I can, and so on that way. But if I can take the ability to select who I work with and I can work with them, not, them just telling me what to do, but work with them to develop a plan that I understand, that makes sense, that has a tiered progression that's going to get me back to sport. At least in my mind, mentally, I'm going to be a lot more comfortable about that. I'm a lot more confident about it because now I have a seat at the table. I've got stake in the process, as opposed to I'm just being told what to do by someone who was recommended because they're nice. And again, I say it because I've heard that story too often, and it's not to necessarily jab at those types of clinicians that way, but at the same time, you have to understand if you're working with someone, what their goals are and how you can best provide for them as a person. And I think the more we kind of humanize this entire process, the better off we're going to be, not just from the physical side, but obviously from the mental and psychological as well. And I would say just as important as choosing your PT and surgeon and so on that way, if you are going to involve a mental health provider in that process, which I highly recommend, make sure it's the right mental health provider, because there's a difference between someone like yourself who's going to school for years and years and years and getting a PhD in psychology and someone who took a weekend course to be able to offer some advice. And I think that knowing the difference between someone who has that additional training and insights and even some research experience as well versus someone who just took the weekend crash course is obviously very essential as far as deciding who you want involved in your team.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you bring up a great point too, in that, as athletes, sometimes we don't realize that, you can kind of shop around for your, mental performance coaches or your PTs or whatever. And it's typically not the situation where, you work with one PT and that's the person that you have to work with. And it's the same thing in the mental health space. And I think a lot of people don't realize that in general, is that a lot of clinicians and, sports psychologists will offer like a free consultation, and I tell my friends this all the time. I'm like, if you are, you're looking to work with a sports psychologist, you should ask to, have a free 15-minute call with them, and see, because oftentimes, a you're going to get a feel pretty quickly as to whether or not, that it's going to be a good match and a good fit. But I also think, as you were discussing before, making sure that you're on the same page about goals and that you feel like you have some control in the process, and that, they're listening to your needs and not just kind of directing the um, I don't know, the session or, whatever experience that you're trying to get out of it.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a great point. And it's interesting because I've talked with a lot of athletes who have no issue shopping around when it comes to the athletic wear or athleisure wear that they decide to, throw on for the day. Maybe some like Lulu, some like Nike, whatever it is that way. They have no issue shopping around. And even when it comes to equipment, I know we talked about this before, but I've tried so many different skis that way. And it's like for a long time, I thought I was married to Blizzard skis and I love Blizzard skis, but after the binding, the marker binding, which we could have a whole separate discussion on my thoughts on binding sometime. When that gave out on me on the top of Vail, I was like, shoot, I need to pivot and find something now. And it was like, well, head was the best option. And now I freaking love head skis. So it's like, sometimes you do need to kind of have stuff experience or happen to you in order to like get that lesson of, hey, it's okay to kind of look around and kind of try a few different things and not necessarily be married to one philosophy or one way of doing things. Sometimes the best thing for you kind of changes, right? There's a quote that I like about how, a man is never going to walk through the same river twice because it's not the same river, but he's also not the same man, right? The same is true when it comes to the equipment that we use and the providers that we surround ourselves with, right? The person that might be the best provider for us when we're 11 might not be the best provider for us when we're 25. That's not to say that they're a bad provider. That's just to say that we're different, our needs are different, and we're going to go with someone else this time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that shows up too in the injury aspect too. You just reminded me, like, I think for people returning to their sport, and this was my experience in particular, there is this sense that you want to get back to what you were doing before, who you were before, that the level of the athlete you were before. And in skiing, it's often this feeling, you want to re-find that feeling. And I think for me, it took me a while to realize like I am no longer that same skier. Like my body is different now. I move in a different way. Like mentally I've gone through stuff. And so I think it took me a long time, but eventually was, really what, allowed me to be successful towards the end of my career was, having this mindset shift of, okay, I shouldn't be chasing this previous feeling that I have. I'm looking for how I can use, what I currently have and the skills and the way my body moves and functions to, try to find a different feeling that is still fast. But I think that we kind of get stuck on this, oh, I just want to go back to the way things were like when I was at the peak of my career. And ultimately things are changing too much to hit that target.
So, with that in mind, what does skiing look like for you currently, Bri?
Yeah. I am skiing probably once or twice a year, so it's been a big shift. There aren't too many mountains out in Michigan where I'm living currently. But I try and get back to the East Coast or back to Colorado or Utah once a year and have a fun ski week or a fun ski day. But yeah, as you said, it comes back naturally when you've been doing it for that long. I feel like I could put on my skis anywhere at any time and it all comes back to me. So that's something I'll always enjoy and always love.
What have been your favorite places to ski at, or any kind of mountains or resorts that you recommend to people a lot?
Oh yeah. I mean, anywhere in Colorado, in my opinion, is hard to beat. I'm probably biased because I grew up there. I love, yeah, I mean, I grew up skiing in the Vail area. Love that mountain. I also spent some years in Crested Butte, which has some really cool, like big mountain skiing and kind of gnarlier terrain. And then I would say just anywhere in Italy. The year I spent over in Europe, we were based in Pozzo di Fassa. And there's just like that whole Dolomite region is super, super beautiful. Would highly recommend if people can make it over to Europe.
Yeah, that's amazing. And for people who, I've heard a little bit about kind of what you're doing now, PhD work and all that way. What does the future look like for you? Would you mind kind of painting a picture of what the next few years may or may not entail for you, Bri?
Yeah, for sure. So I just finished my first year in my PhD program out of it's going to be 5 to 6 years. So I have a long road ahead still, but yeah, it's been fun. It's like a mix of classwork, research, and then also seeing clients. So this fall semester, I'll start working with kids and families. That's kind of my trajectory that I'm going in right now is working with young kids and parents. And specifically, we're kind of in like a low resource area. So, working with kids who have experienced trauma and yeah, kind of are, typically wouldn't have access to therapy. That's one of the cool things about these PhD training programs is because we, don't really know what we're doing or we're being trained. Um, we can provide, like in our learning, can provide low cost services for the community around us. So that's a cool way to make an impact. But yeah, I think hopefully eventually I'll be working, practicing as a clinician, working with parents and families.
That's awesome. And it sounds like from what we've discussed so far, your background in skiing is setting you up on a course for success in relation to that work with little kids and families and so on that way is I feel like you've got so many different experiences on your own end and really, on top of that, just undergoing your first serious injury at the age of 11 that way. I feel like you've got this like unrivaled ability to relate to individuals in similar situations that way.
Yeah, yeah, I'm excited. I've always really enjoyed working with kids and knew that was going to be something that I wanted to do, in some aspect in my career. And I thought about sports psychology for a while, but I think I needed a break from being like that in the ski world and immersed in it. So you never know, maybe I'll come back and dabble in it later on. But yeah, I think that's the plan for the near future.
100%. As you say that, I think of this word that gets thrown out a lot, a phrase, I should say, burnout. And as you mentioned earlier, with early sports specialization, that's something a lot of people raise concerns about that way. Is that something that you see a lot in the skiing world, or is that something that you ever felt yourself kind of on the skiing side of things that way, where you're like, you know what, like I put in like 15 years, like I'm just getting tired of this. I want something new. And if so, like, how did you kind of respond to that, approach that?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think I've kind of seen, I don't know if I have, the perspective on other sports, but within the sport of skiing, you definitely see burnout happening. I think commonly kids go through high school and then they're kind of like, okay, this is it, this isn't for me. The little kid dream that every skier has is, to compete in the Olympics, to be on the national team. And I think realistically, like the levels of meeting that goal, it's so challenging and so hard. And I'm sure that's the same way in other sports. But I think quite kind of when people get to a point where they realize that they're not on the trajectory to reach that goal, it's tough, especially when, you've specialized so young and like maybe you haven't developed that intrinsic motivation. And so really what's keeping you going is this like, external reward and whether that's like feedback from your coaches or like your competitive performance, like winning races or, making, these benchmarks and milestones, making national team criteria when you don't have those, external inputs. I think for kids who never developed that, internal reward and doing it for yourself because you love it, that can be really challenging. And I think that's when burnout happens. And I think, it also happens naturally just as the sport ebbs and flows. I definitely had years where I was feeling really over it. And I think, talking to my friends, everyone has those moments. It's just such a frustrating sport. And like you hit a perfect turn, once every 500 turns you do. And that can be really hard and really frustrating to, stay in it and trust the process and trust that it's all going to work out. Because when you travel, on a 7-hour flight to Europe and you have a week of racing over there and you like DNF every race and you go home, it's like, wow, like why am I doing this? It's tough. But I think when you have that, you remember your why, you have that purpose in the sport. I think that's really what keeps you going.
Absolutely. And that takes time to develop, right? It's not something, at least in my own experience, it's not something that I was necessarily taught growing up. It's like, hey, this is why you ski. This is, how you find your why and your, reason to drive you forward. It just kind of comes with time and experience. And I think that's something that I know we could possibly have a conversation about this in the future. But a few years ago, I did a podcast with a gentleman by the name of Rob Butler. And he talked about how we progress athletes from sport year after year after year, and how a lot of times we lack a coaching framework to do so. And yet, the school system, as perfect or imperfect as you might think it to be, has a framework of, hey, you have to hit certain milestones and benchmarks before you move to the next grade. And I almost kind of wonder in the back of my mind if there's room for something about that personal development side within the kind of progression of sport, where it's like, hey, look, we need to find a way to help kids to realize how they set their own values, how they define what's important to them in sport, what they want their future to look like, and so on that way. Because as you mentioned, I think a lot tend to find themselves in places where that stuff is just told to them as opposed to them deciding it for themselves that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you see a lot of that. And some of that is a maturity thing and an experience thing, you know. It takes an injury or just like a shift in kind of that reward system that's happening, right? I'm relating it to psychology because that's where my brain is right now. But it takes that shift for you to realize like, oh, wait, I'm not feeling the same way I was. And, you know, why is that? And I think that kind of happened to me in college. All of a sudden, I wasn't, I wasn't winning as much and I wasn't, receiving these external motivators. And it took me a second to realize like, why am I feeling differently? What shifted? And I think, the earlier you can help kids kind of realize like, why are you doing this? Are you doing this because you like winning? Are you doing this because you like to be around your friends? You like the speed? You like working hard towards a goal? And obviously, everyone likes winning, hopefully, if you're in the sport. But I think, having that in combination with, these other intrinsic factors is really important in helping kids realize that younger and younger is important because otherwise you have to discover it on your own when you have these experiences and,
Absolutely. No, Bri, I could not agree more. And I realize we could probably talk about this stuff all day long, whether that be skiing, your own journey and experiences, psychological influences and factors, and so on that way. There's just so much to this world that way. Is there anything that we missed in our discussion or anything else that you want to bring up that we haven't had the chance to do so far?
I don't think so. No, yeah. Thank you for having me. This was really nice to chat.
For sure. And for people who want to find out more about you, maybe keep on the lookout for some PhD publications coming in about 5 to 10 years. Where can they find you all at? Do you have like an online presence or that sort of thing? Or maybe you're like me and you still use your third grade MySpace. I mean, where can they find you at online?
Yeah, good question. I am a fairly regular LinkedIn poster, just Bri Trudeau. And then also Instagram. My Instagram is bri.trudeau. And I guess this is super weird. I've never like pitched my like research space, but I am on Google Scholar. If you want to look at articles coming out, we have a couple articles that I've been on that have recently been published that are exciting. So yeah, those are kind of the main avenues there.
That's awesome. We'll link to all of that in the description below. That way, if you didn't quite catch it, you can just click there and see everything that Bri is up to. Bri, this was amazing. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for everything.
Thank you for having me.